People still give me that look when I show up to their door telling them I'm the pest control technician. I suppose it's because I look a lot younger than most of the other folks in my field of work. I thought this was going to be a temporary gig, you know, for the first couple of years after I dropped high school. Well, it's been 5 already. Insects and rodents never bugged me much, pardon the pun, and I've never really figured out why people were so afraid of them. I mean, just look at how big we are compared to how small they are. Then again, I suppose it's easy to get desensitized when you work in this field. A friend of mine who works in the meat shops says the same thing about his job. It's true. We could probably dig our hands into a human carcass and not even flinch. I've dealt with bedbugs, roaches, beehives, rats, you name it. Just about everything. It's not very often that I run into something that I don't want to deal with. This story is one of those rare occasions where I threw up my hands and said, "Sorry, call someone else." I'd been to Mrs. Thompson's place before. She'd spotted mouse droppings around the house, so she called us to get rid of the rodents. It was an enormous house, way too big for one person to live in. Even her cat had a bigger room than I did. My first visit only lasted about 15 minutes. I laid down some traps around the house and then let them do their magic. 2 weeks later, I dropped by again to check on the traps. 6 mice caught, and no sign of any other. It would be another 6 months before we got another call from Mrs. Thompson. This time it was about something else. Her cat Bingo had gone missing, and she was damn sure that raccoons had something to do with it. She told us that she could hear them at night, creeping in around the house, only to scurry away every time she went looking for them. Now, I mentioned before that bugs don't bother me much, but raccoons, on the other hand, pose a very real threat. Many of them are rabid and aren't afraid to attack humans if they feel threatened. I've been taught to deal with them before using non-confrontational methods, such as placing a bright lamp or loud radio in their suspected hiding places. It usually works on raccoons, but those things living in her walls were no raccoons. When I entered Mrs. Thompson's house, this time I immediately noticed a subtle but persistent odor. It smelled like rot. Something seemed off about her otherwise beautiful Victorian home. Upon closer inspection, I noticed a rusty red substance seeping from the corners of her ceiling. Only small amounts of it, though, but enough to leave a brownish stain. I followed the smell to an air vent in her den, one barely large enough to shove a baby through. Peering inside, I saw a few locks of fur, presumably Bingo's. The stench was foul beyond words. When I tried to remove the cover, I realized that whatever critter lurked in Mrs. Thompson's house must have had the manual dexterity of a skilled carpenter. That or very large claws. In the end, I had to pry it open with a knife. Lying flat on my stomach, I reached into the opening and felt around. That was when I grabbed onto what I thought was a tennis ball. Turned out it was Bingo. Well, actually, just her head. I dealt with dead animals all the time before, but I'd be lying if I said that it didn't frighten me a little bit. Parts of her spine were still clinging onto it, as if the head was yanked off in a violent struggle. Its eyes were missing too. The way the nerves dangled out of the sockets made it look like something had sucked her eyeballs out. Then I heard the thing. Its shriek echoed down the duct. A bizarre sound I'd never heard before. I was lying on my back now, sliding my head further into the hole with a small flashlight clasped between my lips, trying to get a glimpse of the culprit. And then I saw it. The creature was staring back at me, its eyes glazed and jet black. Behind it, dozens of eggs were burrowed into the sides of the walls. Some were empty pods, while others were still throbbing with life. I was locked in a staring contest with the heinous creature. I imagine it might have been thinking the same thing about me. It hissed and shrieked, this time louder than the first. Whatever that thing was, it did not belong in this world. Its slimy gray body was dripping with a red, gooey fluid which I first mistook for sweat or saliva. Then some of it dropped onto my mouth, and I tasted the blood-like rustiness of it. I pulled myself out of there as fast as I could and spat out whatever it was that went in my mouth. I gathered my things and darted from the place, not even taking one look back as I ran to my car. I felt bad for leaving Mrs. Thompson's cat on the floor like that. I realized she must have been very unsettled by the sight of her decapitated pet. I kind of expected her to call up the company to file a complaint about me, but she never did. 3 days ago, I was dispatched to deal with an infestation at a house not too far from Mrs. Thompson's. I drove by her block and slowed down when I approached her lot. To my surprise, the once beautiful home had been torn down already, as well as the houses behind it and adjacent to it. I noticed that many of the houses in the area had gone up for sale. There seemed to be nobody in any of the houses in the area. When I drove away from where the house used to be, I heard a shriek coming from behind, echoing in the distance. Just as I was about to turn on the main road, I saw a whole pack of those slimy gray creatures in my rearview mirror, crawling across the street towards their next habitat.